Jorge, good morning. I feel like I haven't seen you, right? This has been the weirdest. So I felt like I was saying it was a weird start to the year already. And then we got through our class. And it was the only class that I had last week, right? I don't know if anyone else had the same experience, right? 10 minutes into the second one, but right, and that was about it. So definitely a little odd, right? And chaotic. So I hope you're all doing okay and hanging in there. It's been a whirlwind of a year so far, right? I saw somebody post something of like, I'd like to cancel my trial membership for this year. Like I've had enough of a preview. No, thank you. But we will move forward today, and we're obviously a little bit behind, but it's okay. We should have plenty of time to make up for it. And thank you for all of you turning in your index card. Hopefully that will help me remember your names. And if you still have it, guys, feel free to bring it up. So we're gonna start chapter 1 today, and I normally do like a little Kahoot review, but I want to try and make up a little bit of the time that we lost. I didn't want to do an online lecture or anything for our first one, because I feel like today's kind of an important topic, and I didn't want to skip to it. So before I move forward, are there any lingering questions about the syllabus, the textbook, any of that kind of stuff? Anything from what feels like a very long time ago that we went over together? Yeah. In a beautiful academic world, that's kind of like the ideal, but you don't have to, right? So for me, I like to read the chapter because then I know what we're going to cover, and then I'm prepared. That makes me feel better mentally. Some people like to read it after or kind of like break it up and skim through it. It's up to you. I would say if you have the time, reading it ahead of time is a good practice, but just at some point, make sure that you do read it, if that helps. Oh, we will be doing one today. Yeah, about an activity. Oh, no worries. No worries. Any other questions? Anything else about the syllabus, the book? Everyone get a copy of your book ordered or on its way or hopefully coming? For plenty of time at this point, right? I'm gonna let go of the how long it's been. All right, moving on. Okay, so before we get into this, I do want to do just one thing. If you have your syllabus, pull that out really quickly. If anyone needs an extra copy or didn't get one for some reason, I do have some extra. Does anyone need an extra copy? So on the second to last page of your syllabus, there's a little thing here about taking notes. Okay, so I just want to make a little, I like to do this in each one of my classes just as I think a good way to kind of think about before we jump into this. As we go through, do you want me to? As we go through, it's a good practice to be taking notes. Okay, so remember that the slides are on Canvas, so you don't necessarily need to write down what's in the slides because they're posted for you online. But what you want to write down is anything else, right? So if I write something on the board, or if there's like a question that somebody asks that's helpful, or I give examples that are helpful, that's the other stuff that you want to write down. Definitely if I write it up on the board. And so what I've seen a lot of people do is kind of follow this format. And it's completely up to you. You can take notes on technology. Some people print it, some people just have notebooks. But if you're writing down stuff here next to the slides, I think a lot of people have said that's helpful. And then you can kind of circle or note things that are in the slides. So just kind of I'll pass this around. Somebody shared this with me a few years ago, and I kind of been recommending it since. I think it's a good practice. And as I said it before, I won't necessarily cover everything. If it's in the slides, we'll probably go through it. But you will notice that there are going to be some things in the study guide that maybe we didn't cover. So that's where that reading that you were asking about becomes handy. But in order to help you with notes, what I'd like you to do, and we're such creatures of habit, right? I'm trying to think back a week, but a few of you that I remember are sitting in the exact same spots. And that's probably your spot. You've already claimed it, like don't you dare try and switch at this point. But I'd like you to find a few people around you and get their name and whatever kind of contact information you're willing to share. It could be a phone number, an email, something from social media, whatever it could be. But if you miss a class, your classmates are probably your best resource for things like notes. Okay, so I want to give you a couple of minutes, find a few people, I gave you 4 spots, you're welcome to do more or less than that. But find a few people who sit around you, exchange information, and if you miss a class, consider reaching out to them for some public notes. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Hello. Good morning. Hey there.
Oh.
I feel like I've been missing that. Like, I feel like I'm doing something. I wish that I would get there. Yeah.
I have you. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're so good. Yeah, no, absolutely. If you want to, yeah.
Too much, right?
Sure, why not? Thank you so much. I'm sure very awesome. I think you and I were going in Mrs. Davis's class in 7th grade in science, and you and I just said worms together.
That's so funny. I don't even remember that.
It took me a second. I was like, you look really for
Yeah, you look at me too. So funny.
All right, did everyone get a couple of people? Couple people with phone numbers, emails, whatnot? So again, if you ever miss a class, of course email me. You're welcome to always email me. Or always welcome to me, either way. But if you miss, right, your classmates might be your best resource for notes. You can find out if it's a homework assignment, any of that kind of stuff. So now you have some people to reach out to. I also wrote this number up here, campus security. So should you need it for any reason, here's our campus security number. If you see something or something happens on campus, or like I trip and fall, something happens to me, somebody campus security or something. So I put that up there. Otherwise, as I mentioned, what we'll do is we'll jump into chapter 1. Not a bad idea, as I mentioned, to be taking notes, especially if it's anything I write down. Any last questions? Anything else about like the syllabus? Anything else so far? Yeah.
They won't make
Yeah.
a big difference on like exams and stuff.
No, so they won't match up in terms of like page numbers
Right,
and
that's
everything, but the content's really close.
Okay.
Enough so that I don't think it'll throw you at all.
Okay.
Yeah, and probably quite a bit cheaper. Right, okay, so chapter 1, finally, right, finally, exciting to get into chapter 1. So what we're gonna look at starting today, and then it'll take us a little bit into our next class too, is how do we figure out what is normal versus abnormal? So it's actually a really, really big question. We'll spend a bunch of time on that today. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the history of abnormality, some pretty shameful stuff if we look at the history of psychology and the things that we've done to try and treat people. And then what is treatment, some current trends, some jobs in the field. Again, we'll set the stage for a couple of weeks and then we'll finally get into the disorders. So this class, right, this class is called Abnormal Psychology. And so the focus of our entire class is the scientific study of abnormal behavior in an effort to describe, predict, explain, and hopefully change patterns of abnormal like functioning. Okay, so the big thing here is we've mentioned the word abnormal like a bunch of different times, but how do we decide what is normal or abnormal? How do we decide if somebody has a disorder or maybe they're just a little like odd or eccentric? Right? Sometimes it can be really difficult to know. And that's something that we'll spend a lot of time talking about today. And I think sometimes one of the easiest ways to kind of get an idea of what we think is normal versus abnormal is to watch somebody pretend to have a mental illness, right? So what are some of the things that they're doing in order to make it seem like they're mentally ill? All right, so I have a clip I'll play for you. So I'm going to hit the lights for that and we'll come back. And just have to watch, right? But pay attention for that easy to spot. We wouldn't have to talk about what's normal versus abnormal, but what are some of the things that he does? Here, let me hit this back on here. What are some of the things that he does to make it look like he's mentally ill? Yeah.
Dressing very typically.
Yeah, his clothes are off, right? They're definitely not typical whatsoever. What else does he do that's kind of off or different? Yeah.
Like a disrespect for personal boundaries.
For sure, right? Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. His facial expressions are really off. Yeah. Yeah, his hair's purposefully messy, kind of all the time, but definitely in that clip, right? What, anything else? Yeah.
Yelling.
He's yelling. Yep. His speech is really like off, right? He talks kind of like gibberish a bunch of times. There's at least one more thing that we could say. Anything else that's off? Yeah.
He seems aloof, like to him, it's very normal, and he thinks the rest of it's abnormal.
Okay. Okay. What about the football too, right? Like he's obsessed with football. I get that, right? But inappropriately to the moment, right? He's not really in the right place. Like all of those things to make it look like he's crazy or mentally ill. Now, sadly, or maybe on a good note, it's much more subtle than this oftentimes, right? Which can make it kind of difficult to identify. But we do have kind of a guideline that we sometimes use. And these aren't diagnostic criteria. Like when you're diagnosing someone with a disorder, you wouldn't look at these Ds of abnormality, but they are kind of a rough guideline to indicate that maybe somebody has something going on. So we sometimes call these the 5 Ds of abnormality. So the first one is deviance. Now, if someone is deviant, right, they differ markedly from kind of what everyone else is doing, right? From what society would think is kind of normal, proper functioning, right? So they're violating norms. And he does quite a bit of this in the clip, right? With his dress and his speech and the obsession with football. You're not following kind of like the sometimes stated or sometimes unstated rules for what you should be doing. There are norms for everything. Super, super simple example. Every single one of you is wearing clothing, right? You knew you couldn't leave the house without putting on clothes. Every single one of you is sitting in your chair facing forward, right? Like how distracting would it be if somebody was just standing in the back corner staring at the wall, right? That would break a norm for what you're supposed to do as a student in a class, right? So when people break norms, we often kind of give them a second look, or we wonder, like, is there something going on? Now, that might not be enough, but it is one of the Ds, right? When somebody breaks a norm where they're kind of deviant or different from what we would expect, tends to be a little bit of a red flag. The tricky thing is there are different norms for different cultures, right? Every culture has things that are considered like normal or abnormal, right? There will be a culture for this class and a culture for your next class that you have, and they'll be a little bit different, right? Because you have different people, different instructors, different topics. So culture sometimes plays a role in this. Your book uses this example of these people that jump into the ice, right? The Michigan icebreakers, I think they call them, right? They jump into the ice every winter as like a celebratory behavior. Now that might feel really odd or deviant to a lot of us, but for that group, it's fun, right? So within that culture, it's accepted. So culture is a factor that we have to consider, but when people are deviant, it tends to raise some alarms. The next one, disorders cause distress, right? They cause you discomfort. They interfere with your life, which is the next one, dysfunction. most of us have some degree of anxiety. Right? Anxiety is really common, it's really normal. But when you have so much anxiety that it interferes with your life, then we start to look at it maybe being a disorder. Right? When you have things that are making you uncomfortable or causing you distress, it's one of the criteria for every disorder. It has to cause significant distress and impairment in your life. Right? So when something is causing you distress or discomfort, it's a red flag. If it's interfering with your life, that would be another one. And then sometimes disorders cause an element of danger. Not always, but it could be danger to other people because you're aggressive or maybe very angry. Or it could be danger to yourself in terms of self-harming behavior, maybe suicidality. So we have an element of danger. And then your book only talks about 4 Ds. I added a fifth one, which is duration. Every single disorder has a criteria for time. So in order to be diagnosed with depression, you have to have a 2-week episode of a group of symptoms. A manic episode is 5 days. Eating disorders is oftentimes a year or 9 months. Right? So every single disorder has kind of this duration piece to it. You have to have it for a certain period of time because everybody's going to react and have like a normal period of time where they have feelings or symptoms. But when it lasts longer than is normal or typical, then we tend to look at it a little bit differently. So these are these kind of rough criteria, and even them like are very subjective. All right, and as kind of a way to start thinking about this, what I'm going to have you do is get into groups of whatever's convenient, right? So it can be like, let's say like 2 to 5 people, whatever's around you. And I'm going to give you each one of these sheets so that you have your own. You're not turning this in, but I would like you to work on it together. And you're going to read each one of these scenarios and you're going to decide, do you think this person has a disorder or doesn't have a disorder? You're not worrying about which one, but do you think they have one or not? And you might wish you had more information, that's okay. But with what you have, disorder or not. So go ahead, find a few people around you and get started. And then we're gonna do a Kahoot to vote on these people. So I'll put that up here in a minute if you want to join at some point while you're learning. So again, as a group, do they have a disorder or not? Oh, extra?
The second line like really makes you. Yeah. Everybody in the phone.
I would say yes.
That there's some.
Disregard is like.
Yeah, I feel like just go down times on like. We'll see flex. Which neighborhood are you going to?
That's true.
Which one are you at?
Sorry, I was. Yeah.
So again, don't worry about which disorder, just do you think they have one or not?
I think maybe also. that she's feeling that that's also could be like she has a very mindset. It's gonna be guys more sometimes. Really?
Yeah.
I also probably most of that's what I told the action. So some are really like, no, I just I Diane. I know it's Diane. I'm just, I'm hearing you and I'm like, wait. Some of those are really bad.
And don't forget, when you finish or when you have a chance to join the Kahoot that's up here, there's a QR code or you can use the code up there.
Yeah. I don't think this is it. I think it's the being. Yeah, like who wants to hear, oh, by the way, I slept with her, I don't want any more, take the kids, like that's the hard thing to do is, but I don't think that's depression.
I would say.
Yeah. It's not like she had it before the kids either as well.
You can reach, but like, personal things, like.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Like, they're gonna need some new weeks with gas. So I but my God.
He doesn't like.
Cause it does say like, oh, is it more this? Cause you have to adjust, especially, you know, it's not right, I love that.
Why you don't? I said, yes.
Like.
It just seems like some sort of like.
Yeah, and then she had.
There's like so like, I know this mentioned also this. So like, I like.
We'll see who's
Like,
yeah, we'll see.
like chronic.
I'm also gonna, but I don't, there's some, I think this one is a lot. That's even better than, like, I feel like. Because like. I feel like so like, you're right. Also doesn't mean to be like. It's a new behavior, like a lot.
You could see.
Yeah.
I feel like if it doesn't mention that, then it might not.
I mean, just have a response.
I did.
We have
Oh,
very
yeah.
different mindset, like a lot of times, it's like, so I was. I knew it's like, I knew it's.
So if you'd like to join the Kahoot, make sure you do. We got lots of happy little faces up there, but make sure you join.
I mean, that's how it works.
And if you can't, you can always jump on with a neighbor, if you are having a hard time getting.
Is it?
They're all so cute, right? I'll give you another minute or so. And then I put the code up here if you get kicked out at any point. But what we'll do is we're gonna vote on these individuals, and you might have felt differently than maybe all of your group members did. And I actually have one clip I want to play for you as well that we'll talk about and vote on first, just to kind of get into it. I think it's a little more dynamic than these folks. So give you just another minute and I'll play that for you, and then we'll vote on all of them. All right. 26. They're almost all in. Okay, so if you're still joining, continue to do so. I'm going to play a clip for you of somebody that I think is a really good starting point idea of like, how are we viewing a phenomenon, right? And so he's in this class of training priests to be exorcists. So they're viewing everything through a lens of faith, right? And so if we view mental illness through a lens of faith, things like exorcisms were commonly practiced. And in theory, if you believed that you were possessed, an exorcism might work, right? It's kind of like that whole placebo effect, right? If you believe you're possessed and we perform an exorcism and that demon is gone, right, you might be better, right? And so I won't say this is never practiced anymore. It definitely is something that is part of like the church and those customs, but it is no longer in favor as it was many, many years ago, when we completely believed that all mental illness was the work of demons or magical spirits. And so we had to get them out of the body somehow. And typically people would be harmed or even die during either one of these procedures. Both of them relatively dangerous and relatively unsuccessful, but it was one of the places that we started. We'll do one more slide and then I'll stop and take attendance. As we got a little bit more forward, we moved into Greek and Roman views, and we had a huge shift, right? So we went from spiritual magical beings possessing people, and we have to get them out spiritually, to thinking that mental illness maybe had a like physical cause to it, right? So if we look at this era of time, we had a lot of philosophers and physicians, people like Hippocrates, who was considered the father of modern medicine. He believed that mental illnesses had natural or physical causes to them. And he talked about what he called humors, that each one of us possess different bodily fluids called humors that flow through our body in different proportions. And if they're out of proportion, it causes problems like mental illness, for example. Now, there is no biological support for this idea that we might be filled with phlegm or too much blood or bile or whatnot, but it was kind of an early idea starting to look at physical reasons why someone might be mentally ill. And so what we saw is that Hippocrates and people of the time, they would take blood from somebody, right, like draw blood and let it sit, right? So if you let blood sit for a long period of time, this is my little like beaker. I know it's beautiful. I'm very artistically uninclined. You'll learn this quickly, right? But if you let blood sit for a long period of time, it settles into 3 layers. Now he added a 4th layer, but if we have 4 layers here of our blood, what he could see are these different fluids in different proportions. And he believed that that correlated to mental illness. So on the bottom, we would have the black bile, right? That dark, like sludgy layer at the bottom would be black bile. And he thought that if you had too much black bile, that you had unshakable sadness, right? So he could tell what your mental illnesses were by how much bile you had or how much blood you had or whatnot. And then the treatments for these things were often dictated by what you had too much of or not enough of. Again, no biological grounding whatsoever, just kind of an early idea. Above that would be your blood, which are the red blood cells. And so if people had too much blood, then he would say you were overly cheerful, right? Which doesn't sound so bad, right? But maybe manic would be the equivalent of what we would say now, like you had manic episodes. And so if people had too much blood, for example, they would do things like put leeches on you to bleed you, or bloodletting, where they would just let blood come out of you to try and balance the fluids that you had. Again, kind of dangerous. People ran into a lot of issues with these treatments, if you will. But a very informal way of gathering information. Above that, we would have the phlegm, which just sounds gross, right? You have too much phlegm, right? What a problem to have in life. But the phlegm is made up of like the white blood cells. And if people had too much phlegm, for example, they would do things like therapeutic vomiting. They would give you herbs and tinctures to make you throw up to get the phlegm out of your system, because if people had too much phlegm, they were thought to be lazy or apathetic and not driven and have no motivation. And then finally, at the top, we would have the yellow bile, which is made up of like the plasma in blood. And if people had too much yellow bile, then he would say you were frenzied, maybe the equivalent of things like ADHD now, or like having like kind of a lot of like psychomotor agitation. And then they would do things to help you get rid of too much like yellow bile, again, vomiting, different like procedures that were very common. The idea here was that it was a physical element. And we see this so much in psychology. It's like paradigm shifts constantly, right? We go through an era of time where it's all spirits and demons and devils, so exorcisms. And then we go to, oh, it's physical causes. So let's do bloodletting and vomiting and all these things to cure it. And then we go back to the church, and then we go to other things, right? We tend to have a lot of theories in psychology. And so this marked a big shift to the first time that we thought that maybe it was something physical, right? And then next time what we'll do is we'll go into kind of some more thoughts. We'll talk about asylums. You can think about stereotypes of asylums over the weekend. And we'll get into like a few more like eras of time before we talk about the last things in this chapter. So I'm going to stop there for today so I can take attendance. Today will be the last time I'll take attendance. And then next week and moving forward, I'm just going to hand out a sheet that you'll sign. That way we don't have to use up the class time for that. But if you want to go ahead and pack up, I'll give you a moment to do that. And then I'll take attendance before we call it a day.